It's time to make a return to the world of Gamehub, which lets us enjoy a surprising number of PC games on Android handhelds. Not too long ago, I tested a bunch of titles across different devices to see how they actually perform. This time though, we're going in a slightly different direction. There's an unfortunate reality that a lot of games you can buy digitally today might not be available tomorrow. So in this video, we're not only going to see how these games run on Gamehub across multiple chipsets and handhelds, but we're also going to use this as an excuse to spotlight some great PC games that have become lost to time. It's an opportunity to allow these past games to live on, and maybe even get discovered by a whole new audience. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we put Gamehub to the test across a range of Android devices, and rescue some great PC games for your handhelds. As always, before we begin, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be accomplishing here for this video. So first things first, we will be talking about 10 different PC games that have been delisted from digital storefronts for various reasons. Some of these games have been delisted for a long time, and some not as long, but I've decided to upload these 10 games to a dedicated spot on archive.org so that everyone can have access to the same files that I used for this video. In the event that any of these return to Steam and other marketplaces, I will remove those files from archive, but for now I figure this is a great way to preserve the legacy of these games. The next thing we're going to talk about here is getting these games running on your Android devices, and I have tested it with many devices, including ones with the Snapdragon 865, so devices like the Retroid Pocket 5, Flip 2, Mini, and the upcoming Mini Pocket Max, as well as the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, so devices like the Odin 2 lineup of handhelds and the newly released Retroid Pocket 6, which I just reviewed on the channel and made it just in time for me to wrap up my testing that I've done for this video, as well as the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2, which is in the Retroid Pocket G2. I received a lot of requests to include the G3 Gen 3 in upcoming videos, and so for this one, I've tested these 10 games on the KONKR Pocket Fit, which has that specific chipset. The AYANEO Pocket S2 is another handheld with a chipset as well. Finally, these games have all been tested on the Odin 3, which has the Snapdragon 8 Elite. So we've got quite the range of handhelds here, which means a good number of my viewers can enjoy these games on their handheld devices. As we go through this video, I'll let you know if there are any specific tweaks needed for a specific chipset and how they perform. While this video focuses on getting these games to work on Android, all of these games are Windows games, and so they should work great just as is on a Windows handheld like the ROG Ally and Legion Go as some examples. To keep this video a little bit shorter, I recommend heading over to a recent video which covered the install and setup of Gamehub in a bit more detail. And so if you need the full step-by-step process, I definitely recommend checking it out. Instead, let's just dive into the default settings that I used for each chipset, and then throughout the video, I will let you know if a certain game needs to deviate from these settings. So for your convenience, I've put on screen the default settings and I start out with each of the chipsets. Typically, I use the latest version of any translation layer, GPU driver, DXVK, and CPU translator that is available, which is a good baseline, and then we can kind of go from there. Typically, expect to run games for the 865 at a base of 720p resolution, and then for the rest of the chipsets, we can go with a target of 1080p in most cases. Now I've got the settings here on screen for the 865, and now on screen are the settings for the G2 Gen 2, and then the settings for the 8 Gen 2, and our newcomer the G3 Gen 3, and finally the 8 Elite. Again, these are just settings to start out with, and then we can work from there as needed, which I will let you know throughout the showcase. And speaking of the showcase, let's just get right into this and start things out with 007 Bloodstone, which is basically a full-on Bond adventure that's not tied to any movie. It feels like its own lost Daniel Craig era story with the locations, the pacing, and just the general vibe that you would expect from the films. In terms of gameplay, it's a third-person shooter that has some interesting mechanics like the focusing, and while it's not groundbreaking, it does feel quite cinematic in its presentation. It's not trying to be like GoldenEye, and that's okay. Instead, it's more like a fast-paced action thriller with driving set pieces and lots of firefights. Sadly, Bloodstone got removed from digital platforms in 2013, along with Activision's other James Bond games, and this one isn't hard to figure out since it's generally attributed to licensing rights expiring around the James Bond IP, which makes it a pain to buy legitimately now on PC. For James Bond fans, this one honestly shouldn't be missed, and it's one of the better games in the franchise. It's also a great way to warm up for Bond's upcoming adventure that very much reminds me of Bloodstone, with 007 First Light coming out next month. For the 865 devices, this one performs very well as long as you turn down the settings to the lowest available, and then use a 720p resolution. But other than that, this game can use the default settings in Gamehub, which we just talked about earlier in the video. For the rest of the chipsets, we can go a bit higher and target a 1080p resolution, and again, just stick with the default Gamehub settings we talked about, and we should be good to go with solid performance across the board from the 8 Gen 2 up to the 8 Elite, with the 8 Elite being able to hit that high settings without issue, whereas the 8 Gen 2 and the G2 will be best targeting lowest settings with a 1080p resolution, and finally the G3 Gen 3 kind of lands in between with medium settings. One thing to make note of, the game might not seem like it supports the controller in-game, but if you go into settings and then toggle on the controller option, it will work properly. You also might need to figure out some of the controls since they're not labeled correctly in-game, but it's easy enough to do. Next up, we've got Family Guy Back to the Multiverse, and while it's not a groundbreaking game, it's definitely one of those games that's way better if you treat it like an interactive episode of the show. You play as Stewie and Brian and comes complete with the humor the show is known for, including tons of callbacks and quick jokes flying at you while you're running and gunning. This is a very straightforward third-person shooter, but it's definitely carried by the characters, the voice work, and just the fact that you're blasting through all these weird multiverse-themed levels as Stewie. This is a pretty popular and frequently mentioned game when it comes to the topic of delisted games, so I'd say it's a fan favorite. And speaking of getting delisted, this actually happened more than a decade ago, and as you would probably expect, it's most likely due to the licensing expiring, which unfortunately is super common with games based on TV shows. Best of all, this game works incredibly well across the board using the default settings for every device from earlier. And we can actually bump up the 865 devices to a 1080p resolution if you prefer, since we can pretty much hit 60 frames per second across all devices at that 1080p resolution. The game doesn't really have a lot in the way of in-game settings from what I've seen, so these are just the default in-game settings. The game does need to have the controller option toggled on in the settings in order for the built-in controls to work properly, but other than that, this delisted fan favorite is a very playable and compatible game. Next up, we've got Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, the Telltale series, and if you like story-driven games, this one's an easy recommendation. It's basically a playable Guardians movie with lots of dialogue, big character moments, and you're constantly making choices while the team bickers, jokes, and somehow still pulls together when it counts. The Telltale series is not a movie tie-in though, and Telltale and Marvel teamed up to tell an original Guardians story. In terms of gameplay, it's classic Telltale with exploration, conversation choices, and cinematic action sequences. So you're here for the vibe more than the hardcore mechanics. And of course, it's in this video because it got delisted. Now after Telltale shut down, a bunch of their licensed titles started disappearing from stores, including this one. So it's not something you can just grab digitally whenever you want anymore. The combination of the shutdown and the licensed IP situation definitely made it a bit more complicated than some of the others on this list. If you missed it back then, it's a surprisingly fun and lost Guardian story that happens to run very well across many of these devices with Gamehub using the default settings from earlier for all devices. Similar to Family Guy, we can bump the 865 devices up to 1080p for this game, but given that the 865 is the weakest chipset of the bunch, you will want to turn down the settings to low and then kind of work from there, but the low settings in general will get you pretty solid performance with this game. Now with the Retroid Pocket G2 and 8 Gen 2, we can bump the quality up a little bit to a high render quality, but even with a high render quality and medium texture quality setting, the game doesn't stay at or near 60 frames per second. Luckily, it's not much of an issue with this game, but again, we do have some room to tweak here. For the more powerful G3 Gen 3, Guardians will run very well at the maxed out settings with 1080p, but will experience more frame dips than the 8 Elite, which basically maxes it all out with, unsurprisingly, the best performance. Now, one thing's for sure, we've got a lot of games based on licensed properties, and up next we've got The Legend of Korra, and this one's a really interesting entry because it was developed by Platinum Games, and so naturally one of the best parts is the combat. You're playing as Korra, and you're switching between fire, water, earth, and air in real time, chaining combos, encounters, so fights feel fast and stylish, much of what you would expect from a Platinum Games title, and like Transformers Devastation, which I've covered in the past, including in my last video with Gamehub, really did take licensed games to a different level, and this will not be the last time we see Platinum Games make the list. It also happens to be a cool bit of Korra history because it's basically a side story that sits around the show's timeline, so if you're a fan, it's a fun way to see the world in a more hands-on way. Unsurprisingly, because Legend of Korra is based on a licensed property, the game was delisted back in 2017, and much like a lot of the Activision-published Nickelodeon licensed games, it's due to the license expiring, and with it went a lot of your better than usual licensed game titles. Now, what is surprising to me is just how well that aging Snapdragon 865 performs with this game, and much like some of the prior entries, we can bump up the resolution for Legend of Korra to 1080p for the 865 devices, as well as across the board, and while performance is generally going to be better with the more powerful chipsets in terms of frame rate stability, the 865 does quite well with normal settings and 1080p, hitting 60 frames per second quite frequently. It's yet another game that does well across all of these handhelds using the default settings, and this really makes me happy that so many handheld owners can potentially enjoy this game on their device of choice with mostly a similar experience. Next up, we've got Lord of the Rings War in the North, and this one's an interesting one that I actually forgot about and started putting some meaningful time into thanks to this video. War in the North was made by Snowblind Studios, a team that was definitely known for action RPG style games such as Champions of Norath and Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, which certainly sparked my interest when researching the topic. This is a co-op action RPG that takes place in Middle-earth and runs parallel to the events of the books. Instead of playing as the Fellowship, you've got a 3-hero party, and the whole game is built around this 3-player setup where everyone has a role, but no worries as this game can be enjoyed fully in single player. The game definitely channels the action and style of other games from Snowblind Studios, but this one isn't presented in the isometric style typically seen in their older games. War in the North is a game that just seemingly disappeared without a formal announcement, happening around 2019 on the Steam storefront, and given the Lord of the Rings property, it's most likely that Warner Bros. Lost the rights to sell games with it. And given that we're now a few games into this, it's very obvious that most games with a license are at a risk for delisting at some point in time. War in the North required a bit of extra work to get it running, as you see here across the board, and initially it didn't look very positive since there was terrible load-in and frame dips and spikes regardless of the device. After some tweaking, it turns out the game does a whole lot better using DXVK without the async option, and so for this game across the board, make sure to use DXVK 2.7.1 or whatever might be the latest version at the time to correct the problem. Now this is still a fairly demanding game, and as expected on the 865 devices you will need to drop the settings and resolution. But using the lowest settings and a 720p resolution, it is playable, and of course, like the prior entries, as we scale up to more powerful devices, we can make the bump up to a 1080p resolution for the Retroid Pocket G2, and then the same thing for the 8 Gen 2 devices, but the G3, Gen 3, and 8 Elite are the stars here, with it running the game at 1080p and maxed out settings. One thing this showcase has been lacking, at least for me, is some type of racing game, and given that many of them do use licensed properties, there are some solid choices out there. Project Cars 3, as its name suggests, is the third and final entry in the Project Cars series, and this one is pretty interesting, as the developers Slightly Mad Studios wanted to make the games a bit more accessible. Now, it's still got real cars and real tracks, but compared to the first 2 games, it leans way more into that Simcade style, making it a little more approachable with a focus on the jump in and just kind of have some fun mentality. Sadly, critics didn't care for that shift, and that's partly due to it being marketed as a direct sequel to Project Cars instead of it being treated as a spin-off, kind of like Forza Motorsport and Forza Horizon. Now, to be fair, the CEO of Slightly Mad Studios lobbied for it to be called Project Cars Sideways. But as is usually the case, investors wanted their mainline sequel. This game was a lot of fun to research, and actually another thing that I uncovered was that this is often considered the spiritual successor to Need for Speed Shift, as that game was also developed by Slightly Mad Studios. Project Cars 3 was released during a tumultuous time for the studio, as there was a lot going on internally, including an acquisition by Codemasters. But publishing was still handled by Bandai Namco due to a prior agreement. Eventually, Codemasters was bought out by Electronic Arts, and with that, the series was cancelled for good. And since it's here, obviously all of the Project Cars games have been delisted, most likely due to licensing issues. In terms of Project Cars 3, it's the newest game being featured here in this showcase, which was released back in 2020, and also the most recent of the bunch to be delisted, which happened back on August 24th, 2025, with an official notice that digital sales have come to an end. It also happens to be one of the few games here that is actually still available for purchase on digital storefronts like GameStop and Amazon, but for the full price of admission, and is the only way to add it to your Steam library officially. This is easily the most demanding game that is being featured here in this showcase, which isn't too surprising given that the game released back in 2020 and was just delisted recently, and as such, I think it's not a surprise that for the 865 handhelds, you can forget about it. I did try using lower resolutions, and while it's impressive that this even runs at all and at these speeds on something like the Flip, realistically this is not going to be the ideal experience for Project Cars 3. Now for the rest of the handhelds, it performs surprisingly pretty well. For the G2 we definitely see some performance gains, and here we are hitting over 30 frames per second, which is what I'd consider a playable frame rate, but this is at a resolution of 960 by 544, which helps keep the game above 30, and unfortunately 720p, while very close to 30 frames per second, is definitely right at that limit for performance. With the 8 Gen 2 we see much of the same performance, and this is one of those cases where the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2 are essentially neck and neck in terms of capabilities. And again, for the 8 Gen 2, it's best to stick with that lower 960 by 544 resolution using the lowest settings possible to get the performance that you are seeing here on the screen. Of course, the G3 Gen 3 and the 8 Elite perform the best here with the most overhead, and in particular, the 8 Elite is the star of the show, which if you've seen my last video with Gamehub, it was something we saw quite a bit using the 8 Elite. The G3 Gen 3 is set to a 720p resolution using lowest settings, and so with the G3 Gen 3 we get that resolution boost. And then again with the 8 Elite we get another boost in resolution, making the jump to 1080p. Which means that we can opt for 1080p and lowest settings or go with a 720p resolution and then turn up the settings. One thing worth noting with this game is that there are in-game settings to adjust, and quite a bit of them, but the game locks this out until after you go through the initial tutorials and then finally start a race in career mode. And if you quit out of this race and go way back to the title screen, you will finally have the ability to adjust the in-game graphics. It's pretty wild to me that during my research for this video, just the sheer amount of games that have been delisted throughout the years. Spec Ops: The Line was a game that stood out to me in particular because of how memorable it still is for me all these years later, where I originally played it on the Xbox 360. And on the surface, it looks like a pretty standard cover-based military shooter. But that's the thing, Spec Ops pulls you in with a story that gets darker and more uncomfortable the longer you keep pushing forward, and it ends up being one of those games that really stays with you, with the developers using films such as Apocalypse Now for inspiration. I don't want to spoil much here, but that ending is definitely something else, and not only is the gameplay and story great, the setting is interesting, taking place in a ruined Dubai with sandstorms that make firefights feel chaotic and unpredictable. Despite the age of Spec Ops, which released way back in 2012, it was only just delisted from digital storefronts in 2024 because of licensing issues with the in-game soundtrack, and so with that, another fantastic game has disappeared from digital storefronts. Spec Ops is an experience well worth exploring and comes highly recommended. Like the other entries here, Spec Ops: The Line does quite well across the vast range of handhelds. I've tested here, and starting with devices that use the Snapdragon 865, which for this game does best at a 720p resolution, but for this one you will want to go with the lowest settings possible, and even cap that frame rate to 30 for the best experience. You can get more frames by changing to a resolution of 540p, but in general, I like the 720p option for a balance between performance and graphical fidelity. Surprisingly, I had the most issues getting the game to work properly with both the 8 Gen 2 and G2 because of some pretty severe graphical issues, and so I definitely needed to spend some time tinkering with those devices to get it running as you see here, which now is free of graphical issues, or at least to the point that it doesn't impact gameplay. For both the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2, we do need to make a few changes, including setting the DXVK to version 1.10.3 and VKD3D to 2.12. I've got the game set here at a 720p resolution using very low settings, and we still can't quite hit 60 frames per second as consistent as I'd like, but we are definitely seeing performance gains coming from the 865, but maybe not as much as one would expect. For the G3 Gen 3, I had some odd drops in frame rate, which would occur intermittently, and I did try tweaking this to find the best combination, and I'm not quite sure what's going on with this chipset in particular, but I think the best compromise is to use a 1080p resolution and very low settings, and for the footage I am set to 60 frames per second, but if it's a real problem for you, you can always cap the frame rate to 30, which will help minimize the impact of those stutters. For the Pocket Fit specifically, I did enable the Disable Graphics Enhancement plugin, and this does allow the game to be much better, but we still get those dips, just not as bad. Now, unlike the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2, the G3 Gen 3 had no graphical issues, so we can just use the default Gamehub settings from earlier in the video. With the 8 Elite, this game will run at 1080p using high settings, but can't quite maintain 60 frames per second consistently, but still runs decent enough with this combination, and again, because we are at 1080p and high settings, we have a lot of room to adjust and tweak as desired. But we are getting quite the jump in visuals and performance with this chipset thanks to the overhead available to us, and as you can see here, the experience is very solid. Finally, for this game, you will want to make sure to install the PhysX dependency under components, as well as set a custom translation parameter. And it's easiest to just go to the Extreme tab and then enable the TSO enabled option, and this change will be needed for all of the chipsets. One of my personal favorite delisted games happens to be TMNT Mutants in Manhattan, and what do you know, it's another Platinum Games making the list, which is probably why I'm a fan of this game. Simply put, it's Platinum Games doing Ninja Turtles, so you kinda get an idea of what to expect here, at least in terms of the fast-paced action that the studio is best known for, and this along with Legend of Korra as well as Transformers Devastation are all games that are way better than they should be considering they are based on licensed properties. Mutants in Manhattan definitely leans into the fast, arcade-style brawler energy, and it's not trying to be a huge open-world TMNT game. Instead, it's much more arcade-style in nature, where you basically drop into a stage, beat up a ton of Foot Clan, and then get into these big comic book boss fights. In many ways, it channels the older arcade-style games, just with the freedom of 3D. The other thing that makes this stand out is the look and the atmosphere. With its cel-shaded graphics, it just feels like you're playing a Saturday morning Ninja Turtles fight scene the entire time. Mutants in Manhattan was delisted across platforms nearly a decade ago back in 2017, and the usual culprit is pretty straightforward, with Activision no longer holding the license to the TMNT franchise, and so this is yet another game lost to time. Like most of the prior entries, this is a great performer across tons of handheld devices, including the ones I've tested it with, like the Odin 3, KONKR Pocket Fit, and of course going a bit older with the 8 Gen 2 devices like the AYN Thor, which only needs a small drop in graphical detail, at least when you're targeting 1080p, and the same goes for the Retroid Pocket G2. The 865 is the weakest out of the bunch, but even handhelds like the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 fare pretty well, but it's best to target a 720p resolution with medium settings. Regardless, we have a lot of room here to adjust, and it's just awesome to see a game that can be enjoyed by many across various handhelds. For the 8 Elite specifically, you will want to use the Qualcomm 849.0 drivers, which minimizes graphical issues. And of course, where there is Ninja Turtles, there's Transformers, and High Moon Studios' take on the Transformers franchise is a special one, and to this day, probably some of the best games in the Transformers universe. Transformers War for Cybertron proves that Transformers games can be genuinely great, and instead of being tied to a movie, it's set on Cybertron during the war itself, so it's basically pure fan service in the best possible way. In terms of gameplay, it's a straightforward third-person shooter, but part of the fun is that it actually feels like Transformers, because you're constantly swapping between robot mode and vehicle mode to move, flank, and keep the fights flowing. Interestingly, the studio originally tried wheel-based vehicle modes, but it messed with the combat movement, so they worked with Hasbro and landed on the hover-style vehicle modes instead. And of course, it's here because it got delisted. All of Activision's Transformer games were pulled from digital stores around the end of 2017, and it doesn't take much to figure out why, which is simply because Activision's Transformers license expired. The PC version isn't perfect as it's capped at 30 frames per second, which ironically makes this a very easy game to run across the board, and the controller support, while it does work in-game, has the same issue as Bloodstone, and so you will have to take a moment to figure out what does what in-game. Now, I easily had the most trouble getting this one to work properly across all of the devices, but I remained diligent as this is one of my personal favorites, and the good news is that, as you can probably see here, the game is working across the board and very well at that, with the ability to set the game at a 1080p resolution for every device and chipset featured in this video. Not only that, we can set the in-game graphics to high across the board as well, and so this is one where for the most part everyone is getting a similar experience. The most important thing here is to make sure you have the PhysX dependency installed, as this game specifically requires it and checks for it at launch. Now, for every chipset except for the 865, we do need to make a custom parameter, and the easiest way to do this is to set to the extreme preset and then toggle on the TSO enabled option. I also recommend toggling on the disable graphics enhancement plugin, which seems to help for this game. I will say that the game can be a bit unstable at times, but it does seem to be much better with those options enabled. Finally, for the 8 Elite specifically, we need to make a few adjustments, and probably the most that we've seen for this chipset in this video. For this one, we will want to use AYN 10.6-ARM64X-2, and the Qualcomm 842.19 driver, DXVK 1.10.3, and finally, we can leave the VKD 3D to Proton 2.14.1 and FX to the latest version available. Also, if it doesn't work after changing settings, just exit out of the game and then boot the game again, which usually solves that issue. One last thing, Gamehub occasionally likes to break the PhysX dependency installation, so if you're having trouble launching the game, just go ahead and double check that, which as you can see has happened to me as well in the past. We've reached the last game for this showcase, and Wolfenstein 2009 is an oddball entry that's become almost as famous for being delisted as it is for the game itself. The game was removed more than a decade ago from digital storefronts like Steam, and also just before we saw the return of the franchise with Wolfenstein: The New Order. Unlike many of the prior entries in this showcase, Wolfenstein's removal is a bit more of a mystery, but during my research it does seem that there were some rights issues between Activision and Bethesda. But officially there's never been an actual explanation. Now, like the other Wolfenstein games, you play as BJ Blazkowicz, but one thing that makes this one stand out is the Veil mechanic, which is a shadow dimension that you can shift into that changes how you fight and how you navigate. And so it's not just another shoot Nazis in quarters kind of shooter. It also uses a hub-style layout with exploration that feeds upgrades, which gives it a nice gameplay loop. And best of all, it's a lot of fun, especially with cool weapons like the Tesla gun lighting up groups of enemies. If you like shooters with a little supernatural spice, this one's a real hidden relic that is sadly lost to history and plays incredibly well across many of the devices that I tested. At first, it might seem like this game doesn't support controllers, and it won't work in-game until you go into the options and select a controller in general under controls, which can be done using the built-in mouse with touchscreen to select. And since this is the last game in our showcase, I think we know how things are going to settle here, and given that Wolfenstein is probably the oldest game here, it's not much of a surprise that even devices with the 865, like the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 here, can handle this game at 1080p using high settings with some frame rate dips below 60. Which means that basically all of the other handhelds, given that they are more powerful, will have no issues with this game across the board. And for all of the handhelds with the exception of the 8 Elite and Odin 3, we can use the default settings for each chipset from the beginning of the video, and you should be good to go. Now for the 8 Elite, you will want to use the Qualcomm 842.19 drivers as well as VKD 2.13 for the game to run properly, and you should be good to go with that. And with that, our showcase comes to an end, and I hope that you come away from this video finding some new gems or maybe rekindling some fond memories of these older games that are now no longer available and sadly lost to time. The good news is that for the majority of the games here, they can be played on a huge variety of handhelds, which means many of us can join in on the fun and revisit these older games that are slowly being forgotten. Let me know what you think about this topic and if you'd like to see more along the lines of delisted games like this in the future. Until the next one, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.